Richard Porter sat in his truck outside Miller's Diner, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. At 58 years old, he thought he'd outgrown nervousness. But here he was, palms sweating like a teenager before prom. His daughter Emma had set this up, called it a casual coffee meeting with her friend's mother. Richard knew better. This was a blind date, dressed up in kinder words. He checked his reflection in the rear-view mirror. Salt and pepper hair, recently trimmed. The flannel shirt Emma had bought him last Father's Day. He looked presentable enough, he supposed. Though after raising 2 kids alone for the past 12 years, presentable had become his highest aspiration. Richard had never planned to be a single father. But life rarely asks permission before it changes everything. His wife Sarah had passed when the kids were just 7 and 9. Cancer, swift and merciless. Those early years had been about survival. Packed lunches, permission slips, scraped knees, and late-night homework sessions he barely understood. Now both kids were grown. Emma was 21, finishing college. His son Daniel was 19, working construction and saving for his own place. Richard had devoted everything to them. And now, for the first time in over a decade, he had space in his life for something or someone else. The trouble was, he had no idea how to do this anymore. The meeting. Inside the diner, Margaret Chen was already seated in a corner booth, watching the door. She was 56, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun and kind eyes that had seen their share of both joy and sorrow. She'd agreed to this meeting partly because her daughter Linda had been so insistent, and partly because, well, what did she have to lose? Margaret had been widowed 8 years ago. Her husband James had been her high school sweetheart, her best friend, her everything. After he died, she'd thrown herself into her work as a nurse, into her garden, into volunteering at the community center. She'd built a good life, a full life. But sometimes, late at night, the house felt awfully quiet. When Richard walked in, their eyes met across the diner. He gave an uncertain wave. She offered a gentle smile. Both of them looked exactly like people who hadn't done this in far too long. "Margaret?" Richard asked, approaching the booth. "You must be Richard," she said warmly. "Please, sit down." They ordered coffee, made small talk about the weather, about the Christmas decorations going up around town. The conversation was polite, a bit stilted. Two people trying to remember how this dance went. Then Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his face changed, softened into something Margaret couldn't quite read. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's my daughter. She's checking in." Margaret laughed, a real laugh that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Mine too. Linda texted me twice before I even got here." The shared understanding broke something open between them. They were both parents first. Everything else came second. It was a language they both spoke fluently. The truth emerges. Over the next hour, their conversation deepened. Richard talked about his kids, about how proud he was of them, about the guilt he sometimes felt that they'd had to grow up so fast, pitching in with household chores and family responsibilities. "They turned out to be such good people," he said quietly. "Better than I could have hoped. But I wonder sometimes if they missed out on just being kids." Margaret reached across the table, almost touching his hand but not quite. "They had a father who loved them enough to show up every single day. That's not a small thing, Richard. That's everything." Her words settled into a space in his chest he hadn't known was aching. Margaret shared her own story then, about nursing James through his illness, about the loneliness that came after, about learning to be a whole person again, not just half of something that used to be complete. "People kept telling me I'd move on," she said, stirring her coffee absently. "But I didn't want to move on. I wanted to move forward, carrying everything I'd learned and loved." "There's a difference." Richard nodded, understanding completely. As closing time approached, they both seemed surprised by how quickly the hours had passed. Richard walked Margaret to her car. The December air was crisp, their breath making small clouds in the darkness. "This was," Richard started. "It was Margaret agreed. They stood there for a moment, two people who'd survived loss and loneliness and learned to build new lives from the pieces. The gift. On Christmas Eve, Richard was home alone. Emma and Daniel had both gone to visit friends at their first Christmas without him. Really? He'd encouraged it, told them it was time they made their own traditions. But the house felt emptier than he'd expected. The doorbell rang just after 7. When Richard opened it, Margaret stood there holding a covered dish and wearing a slightly embarrassed smile. "Linda's at her in-laws," she explained. "And I thought, well, I made too much food. Story of my life. I was wondering if you might. I mean, if you're not busy." Richard stepped aside, his own smile growing. "I've got a refrigerator full of leftovers I don't know what to do with, and a Christmas movie I was about to watch alone." They heated up the food together, moving around his kitchen with surprising ease. Margaret noticed the handmade ornaments still hanging on his tree, clearly crafted by small children decades ago, kept and treasured all these years. They ate dinner at his dining table, sharing stories about past Christmases, the magical ones and the difficult ones. The year Emma had pneumonia. The year Daniel broke his arm sledding. The year Margaret burned the turkey so badly they'd ordered pizza instead. And James had declared it the best Christmas ever. As the evening grew late, Margaret stood to leave. At the door, she turned to Richard. "Thank you," she said softly, "for tonight." "For understanding." Richard took her hand. "Finally, properly. Would you like to do this again? Not a holiday rescue mission, just dinner, coffee, whatever you'd like." Margaret squeezed his hand, and her eyes were bright with something that looked a lot like hope. "I'd like that very much." After she left, Richard stood in his living room, looking at his tree, at the photos of his kids on the mantle, at the life he'd built from heartbreak and determination. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, not just contentment with what he had, but excitement about what might come next. His phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. "Thank you for a perfect Christmas Eve." "Sleep well," Richard replied. "Thank you for reminding me that it's okay to stop being brave all the time." Her response came quickly. "You never stopped being brave. You just stopped being alone." Richard sat down in his favorite chair, a soft smile on his face, and let himself imagine next Christmas. Maybe Emma and Daniel would bring their friends. Maybe Margaret would be there too. And Linda. Maybe his quiet house would be full of noise and laughter again. The thought didn't scare him. It filled him with a gentle, cautious joy. Sometimes the greatest act of kindness is simply showing up for your children, for yourself, for the possibility of connection when you thought that chapter of your life had closed. Richard had spent 12 years showing up for his kids. Margaret had shown him that maybe, just maybe, it was time to show up for himself too. And that was the most unexpected Christmas gift of all.